So, did you guys hear the good news this morning? No? You don't read the news? I got named to be the Environmental Minister of Canada. I've got even better news. All of you guys I'm going to be hiring as my consultants for the Minister of the Environment. So congratulations. All right, guys. We are the Ministry of the Environment now. So let's get to it. What should we do? What should we do? Who's got an idea? Yes?
We should, this is a hot take here, we should start refining our own oil so we can stop getting it from America through pipelines.
We should start refining our own oil. Okay? Everyone agree with that? Should that be the first thing we do? You agree?
Yeah.
Who's got another idea for what the first thing we should do? Yes?
We should switch the carbon tax to a cap and trade program.
We should switch to a cap and trade program from a carbon tax. That's another idea. Who's got another idea for what we should do? Yes?
Run updated analysis on like current water resources and environmental health in the country so we know what we're working with.
Yeah, we should have some updates on what kind of stuff we're working with. You guys got ideas over there? In the back? What should we do? You're working for, you are the government now. What should the government do? It's you. What should you do? Yeah? You gotta speak up.
Ban single-use plastic.
Ban single-use plastic? Another great idea, allegedly. What should we do? So now we've got refining our own oils, we've got switching to cap and trade, we've got getting updates on the water situation, banning single-use plastic. How do we decide what to do first? How do we decide? Yeah?
Review current policies and figure out what can be the highest priority to change.
Anyone have a different idea for what we should do? His suggestion was reviewing the current policies. Yes?
We have to look at our budget and see what we feasibly can do at the moment.
Looking at the budget.
Public opinion.
Yeah, public opinion, that's another thing. Any other ideas? Yes?
You're the minister, so you should probably just decide.
So I should be the dictator? Wow. Interesting idea. Very interesting idea. Any other ideas? Yes? A vote among all you guys?
Yeah, that you preside over.
Sure. So, our topic today is formulating policy. Formulating policy. You guys remember what our policy cycle looked like, right? So just as a reminder, our policy cycle was formulating, then we go implementing, and then we go to evaluation. This was all from, I think, week 1. And then back to formulating, and you remember that each one of these had its own little cycle, right? Of implementing and evaluating and formulating. And then, I didn't make this clear last time, but this can also go backwards too. But let's just focus on formulating. Today we're just focusing on formulating policy. So we've got options. How do we choose? Well, first of all, we have to figure out what our options are. What our options are. How do we figure out what our options are? How do we figure out what our options are? To think about this kind of policy analysis, I think a really good way is considering policy, the policy cycle as a movie, and then each stage of that policy cycle as a snapshot. Okay? So we are in the snapshot of the policy cycle movie right now, which is the Formulating policy. So in this snapshot, what can we understand? If you're looking at a picture, what do you understand from a movie? Can you understand the whole movie? No. Just to be clear, you guys all understand that when you watch a movie, it's made up of a bunch of individual pictures that they just play really fast. So it's the same idea. So we are in the very first frame of this policy movie that we're going to be partaking in ourselves. When you're in a snapshot, you're just taking stocks of things, right? You're not worried about how things are changing. You just want to know what things are now, right? So we have different stock-taking approaches. One way is called a SWOT analysis. SWOT. So SWOT stands for strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So we are now in the Ministry of the Environment. What are the strengths of the Ministry of the Environment? Well, we have all sorts of access, we have goodwill, we've got a certain budget, etc. What are the weaknesses? Maybe there's some old fogies, stuck-up people, some really big jerks we don't want to deal with, but they are impeding progress, etc. What are the opportunities? Given our strengths and weaknesses, what are the opportunities that we can achieve? And then what are the threats? Maybe we've got looming threats about budget cuts or something else. That's one way. You can also do a pest analysis. Pest is political, economic, social, and technological. What is the current political climate? What is the current economic climate? What is the current social climate? How is social different from economic and political? Right? It's like what are the pop culture trends? Right? Is the pop culture trend towards banning green bags or banning plastic bags and more green energy, etc.? Or is it going the other way? If the social environment is going one way, can we use our strengths as an organization to combat those social trends? And then technology is what technologies do we have? Do we have access to park rangers? Do we have access to a strong media liaison team? Do we have a good website, good social media presence? So you also want to identify what you want. Identify what you want. What do you want? What do you want? Do you know? Does anyone know what they want? It's not an easy question. What do you want? First of all, who is you? Is you personally? You as the bureaucracy? You as the federal government? You as the country? You as the globe? Who is you? Who is you? Who are you? And now you've got to, so let's say you sorted out who you are. Now what do you want? Do you know what you want for dinner? Individually?
Pizza.
Pizza. Do you know what you want for dinner tomorrow? You know what you want for dinner this time next year?
No.
No. You don't know what you want individually. Now think you're in an organization. You're in a government bureau, you're in some sort of corporation, whatever. Now you're trying to figure out what you figured out who you are. But what do you want? What is that what? That's not so easy. We've got several problems with this. Especially when you're in an organization with many people. Okay? So we said initially that we have preferences, right? And we said that our preferences are ranked. Okay? So ranked as in there's order to our preferences, and it doesn't make sense so to compare them among different people. So let's say there are two people, say Jim and Bob. And these are the best friends of Jim and Bob. Okay? So Jim's best friends are Alice, Pat, and Bill. And Bob's best friends are Bill, Pat, and Jim. Can we say anything about how much more Jim likes Alice to Pat than Bill or Bob likes Bill to Pat? No. Can we say just because Jim likes Pat more than Bill, that means he likes Bob? Can we make any sort of statement about these rankings? The answer is no. Any sort of comparison between these rankings? You have an idea?
Yeah, so, Bob likes Jim, but Jim does not like Bob back.
That's right. So that we can make that statement. So the issue is interpersonal comparisons of preferences, right? And just by looking at two people's rankings, we can't then make some sort of comparison of how much one prefers one to the other just by looking at the rankings. We also have another problem. So let's say we have three options on the table. We call them alpha, beta, and gamma. Okay? If you take a vote of each pair, okay, so in this class, so let's say A is apples, just call it apples, bananas, and oranges. So let's just take this vote. In this class, who likes apples more than bananas? So a majority want like apples more than bananas. And now we've got bananas versus oranges. Who likes bananas more than oranges? Bananas more than oranges. Now we've got apples versus oranges. Who here likes apples more than oranges? Ooh. Who here likes oranges more than apples? Okay? So if I read it out clearly, you've got A is preferred to B, B is preferred to O, and O is preferred to A. Isn't that weird? Isn't that weird? We call this the Condorcet, or Condorcet, depending on where you're from, paradox. The Condorcet paradox. Marquis de Condorcet. It's the guy who came up with this. And this is true of any organization, any group of people. You can have this sort of situation. I had no idea what you guys actually preferred. I took a big gamble here that this guy writing 200 years ago was going to be right in this classroom today. And wow, science worked. Who could have guessed? Is there a solution to the Condorcet paradox? The answer is no. There's something called the which is called Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. Arrow's Impossibility Theorem says that when you have any group that has individuals who each individually has transitive preferences. Transitive preferences means for you rationally you prefer A to B and B to C and therefore A to C. If you all individually have this, but your preferences are different, and there's no way of changing your preferences, and there is no dictator, then it's impossible to come up with a social preference ring. It's impossible without a dictator to determine what is the best thing to do for a social economy. Not just economy, any sort of group. That goes back to your point up there. How much power should we give to dictators in a group setting? Can we make a decision without a dictator? When you're formulating policy, you're making the choices of just what you want. You're just trying to figure out, what should we even do? What should we even want? We just proved in a group setting that's already impossible. Isn't that weird? Question so far? Yes?
What would the problem be with just taking a vote with all three options being compared at once and giving preference to the majority?
Well, because we have national elections in Canada. We had more than 3 options, and the party that won the election in Canada, the Liberals, they had not only less than the majority vote, they didn't even get the most number of votes. Right? So you always have to come up with some sort of arbitrary rule of how you're going to make a decision. And that rule is going to be looking something very similar to a dictator. And when you have a dictator, sometimes the rules of the dictator line up with the majority will, and sometimes they don't. Any other questions? Yes?
You can't even figure out the fruit preference, how do we figure out who's fit to be a dictator?
Well, how do we figure out who's fit to be a dictator? So, we have different methods historically. In the old days, it was whoever was the strongest, and then it was whoever was born to the previous dictator. And then there were people who said whoever was chosen by the council of dictator choosers. And now we have a vote, where we have here the parliamentary system of ridings, different ridings, and then you vote in your riding for your MP, and then MP chooses the prime minister. And then in the United States, they have the electoral college. Right? Each state has several electors that don't necessarily line up with the population in that state. And it was designed on purpose to be that way, to give more power to smaller population states in order to entice them to join the Union when they were setting the Constitution. In many corporations, they have a board of directors who then chooses the chairman of the board or the president of the organization. In the Islamic Republic of Iran, they have the council of clerics who then chooses the next ayatollah, very similar to how the bishops choose the next pope. The Dalai Lama for the Tibetan monks is chosen by some kind of religious ceremony, where they try to find out where the spirit of the previous Dalai Lama went into. So there are different ways of choosing. Academia. There's been studies on academia. You should look up this guy named Michael Polanyi. I'll write his name sideways here, so you know it's not weird. Michael Polanyi. He said that academia has this problem. Well, of choosing without prices. So these problems only come about when you don't have prices, right? In the market, we know it's easy to choose who should be the boss by where people choose to spend their money. Coca-Cola is the boss of beverage manufacturers because people have chosen to give them the most money. But in academia, you don't give the most money to the science that you like, at least not before the fact. We've come up with some mechanisms like the Nobel Prizes and Fields Medals to reward people after the fact. But before the fact, we've got this something called polycentric organization. So instead of having a central authority, we've got polycentric, multiple centers of authority. So each university has its own PhD and tenure granting committee and process, and then those guys allow who, they set up their own journals, and the journals allow who gets to be writing and publishing in those journals, the peer review process, all these convoluted mechanisms just because they don't want to spend money or they can't spend money on what is the best science. Questions on that at all? So, let's say now that you've chosen your what you want to do. So now the next question is, how do you get there? So how do you achieve your goal? This is also part of the policy formulation process. How do you get to where you want to go from where you are now? You've got to do some brainstorming. So who knows the difference between strategy and tactics? Strategy and tactics. So strategy is an overarching, broad goal. Tactics is the concrete methods that you're going to use. So you could have a strategy of getting a job. Big goal. And your strategy is going to university, doing well in your classes, and then applying to all the good jobs and getting the best one from there. But what is your tactic for picking the correct methods of getting the good grades? Right? So you get to school, and instead of studying, you choose to smoke dope. Is that going to get you the good grades? Probably not. So you had the right strategy, but you had bad tactics. Tactics in policy world, we call that implementation. But in the formulation process, that's strategy. You're setting out your strategy for how you're going to implement your policies. You'll probably want to talk to some experts, right? And you also want to talk to some, what we call stakeholders. Talking to stakeholders. Anybody know what a stakeholder is? Yes?
It's broadly speaking, everyone who has an interest in whatever project you're approaching.
Yeah, anyone who has an interest in the project that you're taking on. It comes, the language of stakeholders is kind of borrowed from shareholders in finance. In a corporation, there are shareholders, and those guys have bought into that corporation. They're entitled to the dividends of that corporation and the profits, etc. Stakeholders is broader than that. Stakeholders can be, for a corporation, their customers, or potential customers, or the regulators. The reading for this week is going to be on how the Ontario Environmental Ministry, on how they do their policy formulation process. And a lot of it is consulting with stakeholders, and they do that through public meetings and all these other things. I'm trying to figure out who cares about what and what should be done. also thinking about strategy, you'll probably come across something called game theory. So you've all taken biology classes. Have you come across game theory in your biology classes? No? Okay. So game theory isn't just about games. It was invented by mathematicians and economists, but it's now used in a lot of different fields. It's a snapshot look on the decision-making process. Okay? And to define a game, we have players, we have outcomes, and we have a move set. Okay? So a game is anything with players, outcomes, and move set. And the most famous example of a game is called the prisoner's dilemma. Anybody heard of A Beautiful Mind, the movie? Yeah? Not so many of you. It's a really big, popular movie. It's about a guy named John Nash who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. He was a mathematician, won the Nobel Prize in Economics for coming up with this kind of game theoretical analysis. It was his PhD dissertation. And if you're familiar with PhD dissertations, they're usually a couple of hundred pages long. His dissertation on this was 15 pages long, and he won basically the Nobel Prize for it. He's a smart guy, and this is how the prisoner's dilemma works. So there are two players, call them B and A, and this is their outcome matrix. So we've got this table. So the story goes like this. The games usually have some sort of story. The prisoner's dilemma is this. The police have apprehended a couple of people who they suspect of committing a crime. To do this, they've isolated the two suspects in different rooms, and they're trying to get them to confess to the crime. How is this going to work? So we've got the players are the two prisoners. We've got the outcomes, which is going to prison or being set free. And we've got their strategies now, or their move set. And their move set in these isolated rooms, each individual suspect can either confess to the crime or they can stay silent. Okay? And because they're in separate rooms, it's important to know that there is no communication. The two suspects can't communicate with each other. And this is what they can do. They can either stay silent or they can confess. That's A's choice. And B can also stay silent, or he can confess. Right? So each square here is potential outcome. So they can each stay silent, and I'll show their payoffs in terms of prison sentences, like so. So if they each stay silent, they'll each go to prison for 1 year. They'll each go to prison for 1 year. The top is for B, the bottom is for A. If B stays silent and A confesses, B will go to prison for 3 years, and as part of the plea, or as part of the bargain, he'll get 0 years in prison. B gets the same deal. If B confesses and A stays silent, B goes to prison for 0 years, A goes to prison for 3 years. And if they both confess, they each go to prison for 2 years. What's going to happen? Who's got an idea? Are they both going to confess? Are they both going to stay silent? Or are they going to do opposite things? You got an idea? Let's remember what the rules were. So there's no communication between them. And each of them can only do one or the other. Okay? You've got an idea?
Depends on the people.
Depends on the people.
I think in most cases they would both confess.
They'll both confess. Interesting. Yes?
I feel like the one guy's gonna pull Takashi 6ix9ine and snitch on the other guy, but then the one guy would keep silent.
Which guy? A or B?
I feel like B would snitch.
Okay. Something about the letter B looks like a snitch to you?
Are we assuming they're both in fact guilty? Because I think that way if they're innocent or they're guilty, we change their behavior.
That's irrelevant to this question.
But if you're innocent,
So you're under pressure, right? So the cops think that you've committed a crime. And they say, we're gonna send you to prison for 1 year if you stay silent and the other guy also stays silent. Right? Only if you confess and the other guy stays silent, that's the only way that guarantees you get 0 prison sentence. Yes?
I think they both would want 0 time, but there's the risk factor, knowing that the other, if they confess and they both confess, there would be the 2-year sentence, so the safest route would just to be silent.
Interesting. Yes?
I think they both confessed unless they like really trusted each other and had it arranged beforehand what they were going to do.
That's also very interesting. Here's how we analyze game theoretic situations like this. For A's decisions, you take B's decision as given. So if you say, if B is definitely going to stay silent, what's the best outcome for A? What's the best outcome for A? Is it to stay silent or to confess when if he knows that B is going to stay silent? He's going to confess or stay silent? Confess. So we draw a little circle around that. Okay? Now if B was going to confess for sure, or A thought that B was going to confess for sure, what's he going to do? Is he going to stay silent or confess? Confess. 2 years is better than 3 years in prison, so he's going to confess. Now we do the same thing for B. If A is definitely going to stay silent, or B thinks that A is going to stay silent, what's B going to do? Stay silent or confess? Confess. If A was going to definitely confess, or B thought A was going to confess, what's B's best outcome? Confess or stay silent? That's -3, that's -2. 3 years in prison or 2 years in prison? He's going to confess. This outcome, we call this the Nash equilibrium, named after that guy John Nash. Nash equilibrium. They're both going to confess, even though they would be better off if they both stay silent. By separating them and taking away the ability to communicate, they will both stay, or they will both confess. The gentleman in the back brought up an interesting point. What if they could have some sort of agreement beforehand? If they had some sort of agreement beforehand, then we've broken the rules of the game, of this game, and we have to now consider a different game. Right? By changing these outcomes, by changing the rules, by changing the payoffs, it becomes a different game. So we have to then analyze it differently. In criminal organizations, they typically have a situation where, you've all heard the expression, snitches get stitches. Right? So if you know you're part of that kind of organization, then that changes your payoffs for staying silent. Right? So you might go to prison for a year, but at least you'll stay alive. Or at least avoid a beating. So that'll change your calculation. This is also a snapshot game. Right? If some people like to pretend that this is how the market works for corporate strategy. But in the market, it's never just one-shot games. It's an extended game, a repeated game. You're playing over time. And by playing over time, you can develop different strategies, right? If somebody screws you over in the last round, you can play tit for tat and screw them this round, and they can then think ahead. Oh, if this guy's gonna play tit for tat, then I shouldn't be screwing him in this round. When you're formulating policy, you have to take the strategic approach, right? If the environmental department is going to take one action, what are the other departments going to do to react? What are businesses going to do to react? If we increase carbon taxes, are the businesses just going to smile and pony up? Or are they maybe going to move to another jurisdiction where we'll have to pay lower taxes? That's part of the policy formulation process. You have to know and predict what are people going to do. Any questions? Yes?
Why is it not possible that they both stay silent? Didn't support anything in that quadrant.
It's because in every sort of outcome, it's always preferable to confess. In any sub-game, we call that. Any sub-game, which is, you know, B is definitely going to confess or stay silent. This is a sub-game of the whole game. This sub-game, it's going to be better to confess. In this sub-game, it's going to be better to confess. This sub-game is going to be better to confess. This sub-game is better to confess. Any other questions? Yes?
So if they had made an agreement in advance or they were friends, how would you change the rules of the game then?
Yes, so if they made an agreement in advance, they would change their payoffs, right? So if they agreed in advance that we're going to stay silent or else, that'll change the payoffs. Yes?
Can you apply this to every game? Sorry, can you apply this to every game?
You apply the same strategy of breaking down what's your best outcome given the other player's moveset. That's for every game that looks like this. There are, for repeated games, we call that extensive form games, you do what's called backwards induction. So you'll have a game like this, where you choose like this, and then you choose like this, right? So you'll have outcomes like -1, 1, 0, -3, -3, 0, and -2, 2. And then from here, you choose your best outcome first. So for you, it might be -1, 1. And then you work backwards. What choices do you have to make to get to that outcome? We call that backwards induction. Yes? If there are more than 2 players, it gets more complicated to graph, but you use advanced higher-level mathematics to work through it that way. Any other questions? If that's it, then we'll see you guys on Monday.